Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. We invite you to follow us on Twitter at MacArthur1880 or find the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial on Facebook. Today we're sitting down with Andrew Robertshaw, a military historian, archaeologist, author, and an educator who specializes in the history of World War I. He has also served as an advisor for the films War Horse and 1917, among others. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Today we're going to be talking about World War I archaeology and the excavation and identification of human remains. Can you start us off, though, with a little bit about your background and your work in World War I archaeology?
Okay. A number of years ago, about 25 years ago, I went to a lecture on the identification of human remains. And I remember coming out and saying to a friend, a business colleague, God, that sounds dreadful. Within 2 years, I was involved in it, purely because I'd already been doing work for BBC Television, a television series called 2 Men in a Trench. The BBC asked me to run a project to try and locate a dugout used by Wilfred Owen, the poet, who's very famous over here, who died in the war and wrote a poem called Blinded, or The Sentry. And it was based in a dugout. We knew roughly where that dugout was, and we spent a week working. However, as soon as we began work, we found human remains, which we'd anticipated, but we didn't in any way imagine what it would lead to.
Wow. Let's talk about how the World War I combatants dealt with the incredible number of casualties from 1914 onward. It's really something that seemed to overwhelm all of them. So how did the combatants deal with their war dead?
It's a funny thing from your perspective and from mine as a Brit that we were surprised, shocked by the number of casualties. Bear in mind that at Borodino in 1812, there were 60,000 dead and wounded. Those numbers are staggering. The British Army, basically, we arrive in France with 120,000 soldiers. That would be half of the army gone. So Europeans are used to it. They've dealt with mass casualties in the war of, the Napoleonic Wars. They've dealt with it in the Franco-Prussian War. We walk into it as innocents. We have no idea what this is going to mean. Okay. And then the casualties start mounting. And our first battle, we have 300 dead. It's a lot of people. But 2 days later, the French army, wait for it, they have 55,000 men dead in a single day because their army is 1.7 million. We've turned up with fewer soldiers than Belgium, which you've got to admit is slightly embarrassing.
Does the war lead to major shifts in terms of burial and mourning practices?
It's already begun for the Brits, for us, in the Second Anglo-Boer War, which is 1899 to 1902. Until then, war dead just go into pits. Nobody really worries about it. There is no monuments for the missing soldier of Waterloo. But suddenly we have a war which goes on for 3 years. And for the first time, it's not the military caste. It's not the long-term volunteers are serving. It's now what become the territorials, our reserve forces. So suddenly it's your son, it's your nephew, it's your cousin that gets killed. And there's a demand from the UK public for something to be done for these people. So we start getting war memorials at home and the beginnings of war cemeteries. So I suppose we have an inoculation of modern warfare that ends in 1902, just 12 years before the First World War begins.
Wow. Now, you've written about how surprised some Anglo-American tourists are when they see ossuaries in places like France. But you point out that this type of memorial or burial isn't just done out of expediency. It's not perhaps in the eyes of the Anglo-American tourist, something not respectful. You point out that it's done in a cultural context. Can you talk to us a little bit about those cultural differences between the Allies, particularly the French and the British, that would make something like the burial of the dead in an ossuary very appropriate?
Okay, I mean, the thing about the French cemetery is that you basically rent the plot. You're not there permanently. Same possibly for Italy or Spain. You're not there permanently. You will eventually be turfed out. And at that point, you probably go into a mass burial. If you think about going to Rome, you can see, skulls and long bones in ossuaries underground. Nobody particularly worries about it. But because of the Protestant nature rather than the Catholic nature of British society, is that we just don't like that kind of thing. It's not what we do, but it's what they do. So, as you say, the idea of going to Duomo or Verdun and seeing hundreds of thousands of skulls or body parts, it's an absolute shock, and it seems incredibly disrespectful. But it's not if you're actually French. And more importantly, their casualties are so staggering that individual burials or sending Jean-Pierre back to Brittany is virtually impossible in the conditions of the Great War.
Now, World War I archaeologists don't go looking specifically for human remains, but there is an understanding that remains are usually likely to be recovered in certain sites. Now, some argue that the remains should be left undisturbed on the site. You don't agree with that, though. And why do you think it's important to recover those remains when found?
The American anthropologist and archaeologist Melissa O'Connor said that if you find human remains from conflict archaeology, and you don't do everything you can possibly to identify them, it's like, and she said, killing them twice. And she was actually talking in terms of the soldiers that fell with Custer, that she was involved in the Little Bighorn dig. And I took that to mean that actually every soldier, every serviceman and woman expects, if they die in war, to have an appropriate and honourable burial. The idea of being regarded as being the detritus of war that simply could be ignored is, I think, for many an absolute anathema, that's not what should happen to me. I want them to know my name. I want them to know my regiment. I want them to know, if they were American, which state you came from. That's really, really important. And for many, many servicemen and women I've worked with, whenever I'm guiding, they will say, yes, if that happens to me, I don't want to be unknown. That's the frightening thing. I don't mind necessarily dying, but I don't want to go into basically an unknown grave. I want something that people can remember me by.
Right. Now, when we talk about World War I, it's just a little over 100 years ago now, but still relatively close to us. Does this sometimes complicate the recovery and identification of remains?
Yes, it does and it doesn't, insofar as there are different practices. In the point of the American Defense Prisoner of War Missing in Action Accounting Agency, based in Honolulu, they are actively searching for war dead, but wait for it, not from before 1918. So there are groups, up to 5 of them at any one time, searching the world, whether it's Thailand or Laos or whether it's Korea. They're looking for these guys and girls. In the case of the Brits, we don't actively look, but if they're found, there is a slightly complicated procedure for recovery of them, in which you might actually be incredibly unlucky, by which I mean if you're buried too quickly, no DNA or samples are taken, and you go from being an unknown to being an unknown. Whereas we have a situation that you might be aware of, that the Australians basically petitioned the Commonwealth War Graves Commission for permission to run an archaeological dig to excavate people who were buried in a mass grave. Once that was done, and those bodies were all excavated by Oxford Archaeology, and DNA was recovered and other isotope analysis was done, then it opened the floodgates to say, right, whoever is now found, they should be sampled. It's expensive, but they deserve to be identified. And there was a definite conflict. I mean, in the case of the US, casualties from Pearl Harbor have recently been DNA'd, even though, wait for it, the body parts were separated in the 50s for reasons I don't begin to understand, so they could be put back together again and then given to the families or go to Arlington, whatever appropriate. So people do it differently. And for us, for the British, if you're buried in a war grave and your family think, it's my great uncle Fred, hard luck. If they're buried in a war grave, you cannot be exhumed or sampled. So even though you've got a very strong case that says, this is great uncle Fred, we know where he fell, we know where he was recovered, they couldn't at the time identify him, hard luck, he's going to remain unknown.
Very complicated.
It is. As you say, it's complicated. It's complicated by different procedures, and it's complicated by, to some extent, by the expense of the entire procedure. It is getting cheaper, but clearly from us, we have about 800,000 dead, of whom about 200,000 to 300,000 are missing. Just the idea of even excavating all those who are buried as a soldier known unto God, that's what it says on the headstone, and saying, look, we might be able to work out who it is, would be almost impossible. But wait for it, that's exactly what the Dutch are doing at concentration camps in Holland. They're exhuming every single person and DNAing them to find out who they are.
So talk us through the process of excavating human remains in the field.
Okay, the first thing that happens is before you arrive, you warn the War Graves Commission that you might find remains. You might also warn Souvenir Français, which is the same as the American Legion, basically, because they're responsible for recovery in France. You may well tell the Germans, the VDK, the Volksdeutsche Kriegskavalen, that we're going to be working, but they don't have agencies in the Western Front. They are purely at the moment interested in the Eastern Front because they have 1 million missing from the Second World War, and Great War is kind of fallen off their radar. Curiously, they also get no state funding, unlike the War Graves Commission or your DPAA. There is no state funding for that, mainly because of war guilt. So if you find human remains, you need to tell the relevant authorities. You might do. As soon as you find human remains, you call the police. The police come and they will then agree that you haven't found Monsieur Saman's wife or a murder victim. Then you've got permission to carry on. The War Graves Commission will come and explain what the protocols are. You know what they are, but they need to do it. Then the excavation begins. And normally what that would mean is that a team of archaeologists will stay with the remains throughout the process. At no point is that victim ever left on his or her own, because there's always the possibility of battlefield scavengers come in, and we were hit once in the night by people who came in using metal detectors and dug through a set of human remains. We learned the hard way, you stay with them until they're out of the ground and they are somewhere safe. And then the really hard work begins. My job in that process, by the way, is buttons, badges, equipment, because I'm not a trained archaeologist, but what I am is an expert on what these guys are wearing and what's in their pockets. So we can work out, are they Brits? Are they Germans? Are they Belgians? And from their gas masks and helmets, roughly when in the war did they fall? And then to the unit, and it descends down like that. And we always work then with the university, with the conservation department, because it may be that they need to X-ray, they may need to conserve items to determine who somebody is.
So you mentioned these objects of material culture that help you identify kind of the nationality of the soldier. You mentioned helmets, gas masks. What other types of artifacts are you using to help make that identification of nationality?
Pocket contents, clearly. In the case of one of our German dead, he had a little glass dish from Brüning Brothers, a company in Stuttgart. Now, that could have been a Brit with German objects in his pocket, but his buttons were from the correct area, actually from the area around Stuttgart. So we were able to narrow him down to a regiment almost on the spot, if that makes sense. He also then had a manicure set with him, no watch, which said he wasn't necessarily a wealthy soldier, but we were also able to work out he died early in combat because basically his equipment was full of more ammunition that should have been in it. Someone had taken his rifle and bayonet, but he was still wearing his equipment. So that was one way. He also had an ID tag made of zinc. At the time it came out, it looked a little bit like a cracker. It was so corroded. In the case of one other soldier found in the same area, he had full pocket contents, his watch, his money, very, very importantly, a book that turned out in the end to be a bank book. And it was the bank book which allowed us to identify him.
So it's a lot of detective work in the field as you're finding these items.
It is. And curiously, one of the issues about leaving the bodies where they are because they're okay is that the scientist Fritz Haber, who was born Jewish but converted to Christianity, is the man that invented basically nitrate fertilizer, synthetic nitrate fertilizer. It's wonderful stuff, brilliant. Unfortunately, is incredibly corrosive on metal, paper, wood, and bone. So if somebody's buried in a wood, they're relatively safe. If they're buried in a farmer's field, every year more corrosion occurs, more the body decays. They are not safe underground. The kind of assumption is, oh, well, they'll be okay, leave them alone. It's not the case. And by the way, Fritz Haber is the man that actually masterminded the first ever gas attack at Ypres, a very, very interesting and complex character who, by the way, had the Nobel Peace Prize. How about that?
Now, moving from the field to the laboratory, what role does DNA play in this process? And can you walk us through that?
Okay. Our early days of working on human remains was before the Fromell project, before the Australian and British project. We were not allowed to take either isotope analysis or to take DNA. We all know how DNA works, I suppose. It's on the maternal side. Isotope analysis is something else that allows you to work out largely from bone, particularly from teeth, where somebody was born, where they grew up, where they moved to. So in the case of a project I wasn't involved in, with the recovery of a soldier called Mather, an Australian, they were able to identify where he'd grown up in Australia, not from his DNA, that came later, but actually from the traces of material based on what he'd drunk as a child, as an adult, in the area, because they're unique markers. And that means that you can then say, okay, so he was born in Australia, he spent some time in the Middle East, actually Turkey, Gallipoli, that's where, then he came to France. So you're able to, and they were able to work out basically the town where he came from. Once they'd done that, having established the fact that he was an Australian from what he was wearing, they were then able to go back and do the DNA in a targeted way. Because clearly, if you find somebody who's died, we've got 800,000 dead, 200,000 missing. You find somebody, you can't go, well, just DNA them. We'll have a sample from some member of the public. It's not going to happen. It needs to be focused. So the combination of the isotope analysis together with DNA allows you to work it out. And very often, there's something personal with your soldier that gives you a clue who it might be.
Okay. So it's the isotope that helps you narrow down
Correct.
A little bit who that might be, along with the material culture, the little artifacts that you're finding. And
Absolutely.
Then from there, you can make a more targeted look in terms of DNA.
Absolutely. You can advertise. We on one occasion advertised without DNA. We simply got somebody who we'd already identified through their ID tag. His grandson advertised looking for the relatives of another soldier that died with him. They would have known each other. And sure enough, by putting an advert in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, basically the South German newspaper, looking for this man, a member of the family went, hey, look at that. That's my great uncle. And that's how they found him. And it was so definite based on his height, the appearance of the skeleton and everything else. We actually didn't bother with DNA. Even if we could have done it, it would have been pointless on the basis that we knew who he was. And in the case of our first ever soldier, for me, the big eureka moment was knowing that this soldier in his 30s, 6 children, farm laborer, had in his pocket, would you believe, a manicure set. Meeting his grandson, who was identical in height to his grandfather. Never knew him, by the way, of course, because he died in 1915. But the key thing was he was incredibly well manicured. And I didn't have the guts to tell him, do you know what? Your granddad was as well manicured as you. It seemed too personal. I know I chickened out. I don't know why.
Mm-hmm. Interesting coincidence.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Now, do you know how often World War I remains are positively identified?
I would say at the moment, 12 to 50 a year, depending on what's going on. Some are found purely by ditching, some are found in agriculture. But clearly, if you're putting a new road in, or you're widening a road, or in the case of quite recently in France, building a canal, you will find a lot of them. So it depends on what processes are going on. And then the next thing would depend upon who is then involved in that process. There was previously a group of enthusiasts, let's call them that, who worked around Ypres in Belgium. They recovered 200 sets of remains and identified one by name. That suggests to me that they were more enthusiastic than they were talented, because they weren't archaeologists. They were very largely a very dangerous combination, enthusiastic collectors. You see what I'm saying?
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
You've mentioned a couple of different examples, specific case studies you've been involved with or know about. Do you want to share other examples of cases you've helped with?
Yeah, I mean, one of them was a man that we found who we were doing another job. We weren't looking for him. We failed to completely take out a collection of 7 German soldiers. Sorry, 5 German soldiers. The bottom man, we couldn't get to his pelvis and legs in the time available. So we agreed with the Germans that we would go back and recover him. He would be buried as a complete soldier. The man, 2 men up above him, was a man called Leopold Rothermel. And Leopold had the advantage of being the middleman in a group of bodies buried in clay. Why is that an advantage? Well, because basically the bodies around him had decayed more extensively than the guy in the middle, which meant that Leopold, when he was found, was still wearing his complete uniform with his number 16 embroidered on his epaulets. He had his Iron Cross ribbon, and he had a letter, a postcard from his mum in his pocket. So we found him that way. There was no question about that. And also the state of the body, when we eventually went to the archives in Munich, it said he'd been shot in the abdomen. We found a lot of disruption there. Because we went back to that site, we had only space for 3 or 4 archaeologists. We had a team that was bigger, so we just put them to work. And almost immediately, we found a slot in the ground, which is a grave slot. Now, if I find one of those in Roman archaeology, or I find it in Anglo-Saxon, it's normally slightly wider for the top of the body than the bottom, because that's your shape, isn't it? In this case, the idea of finding a grave seemed unlikely, and for quite a long time we thought it might actually be prehistoric, till we got down to him and found, guess what? It's a German soldier. But when that was done, we made a remarkable discovery. One, he'd been buried the wrong way round, and he was actually squished in at the wrong end because he'd been buried in the dark, and whoever dug the grave, the information wasn't passed on to the burial party, but they'd gone to a lot of bother to bury him. And very importantly, despite all of those, oh, well, if you get killed in a war, either your mate steals your valuables or the enemy do, he had round his neck 3 rings. He had a wedding ring, one that said Martin, one that said Becker, the date 1883, and then a little aluminium ring which said Flanderen, Flanders. So it's obviously his ring. And he was wearing them with his ID tag. Sadly, his ID tag had corroded, but the gold was perfect. So what we were able to do was work out German marriage practice is you exchange rings with inside it the name of the 2 parties, Alfred Martin, Maria Becker. Then we went to the archives and we looked for somebody with the correct name. And sure enough, we found him. But what it revealed was far more about basically the 20th century than you'd ever imagine. In the case of our Leopold Rothermel, he was in the same regiment as Adolf Hitler at the same time. They were the same age, they had the same rank, they even had the same medals, and they would have known of each other, not least being Leopold was a concert violinist, ran the band in the regiment. So Hitler would have seen him and heard him play the violin, which is amazing. But in the case of Alfred Martin, we kind of made the assumption that there was a grieving family out there. Wouldn't you think that? There's going to be a grieving family, surely, even though he died in 1915. We went, and courtesy of TV money, we found the family. We had the rings. We took them with us, and then we said, look, clearly the family, the parents died. These were then worn by him in combat, and his comrades buried him. Basically, the head of the family went, no, that's not what happened. Well, what happened? Maria was much younger than Alfred. Maria ran off with a teacher. Alfred then got another young woman pregnant and had to get married, so that the local, basically, records said that Maria had died, otherwise the marriage was bigamous. Then we discovered the real reason why the family were very angry, was that in fact, during the period after the marriage, clearly, Alfred didn't get on with the stepmother. Whether she was wicked or not, I don't know. But he managed to bankrupt the family by not bringing a harvest in because he had a girlfriend, just like his dad. So he was thrown out of the family home. And you could almost recreate that moment when Alfred reaches into his pocket, takes out his ex-wife's wedding ring, now living with a teacher in the village, and his own wedding ring, and says, take those, get out, you're a bad lot, your mother was a bad lot, I never want to see you again. And that family story was so strong that when we eventually met the family, they said, bury them with him. We don't want anything to do with him. Curiously enough, by the way, the daughter said very quietly to us when the father had calmed down and wasn't in range, when he's buried, I'll come. I want to come and find him. I won't tell my dad, though. So it was really something excavating a family and also demonstrating that, soldiers aren't always plaster saints. They're not all angels.
Right. I mean, they're a cross-section of everyday society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Those are some fascinating stories. I mean, the science, the archaeology, the history, all coming together to kind of reveal these stories that we wouldn't know about otherwise.
Yep. Absolutely. And what's really interesting is meeting then Walter Rapp, and then Walter saying to us, well, my grandfather was killed, my mother remarried, she married a Rapp, somebody called Rapp, R-A-P-P. He died in a Soviet prisoner of war camp in 1947, and two of then Jakob's sons died, one basically on the Western Front, one on the Eastern Front. He said, wars for my family, wars for Germany have been a disaster. And I often feel that one. But he thanked us so profoundly, and then was able to find Karl Thielecker, who was the great nephew of Albert Thielecker that we also found. And the two of them paid for a memorial for their relatives, but also an unknown British soldier we found at the same time. And when we stood there with the director of a museum, the Museum of the Grande Guerre, the Museum of the Great War from Peronne, he stood there, looked at this small memorial, not very big. He said, this is the most unusual memorial on the Western Front that I'm aware of. Why is that unusual? Because it's small? He said, no, because it actually is dedicated to an enemy as well as their own people. In other words, the no man's land is no man's land. It doesn't belong to anybody. Everybody has a share of grief. And it was an incredible moment. And Monsieur Samin, the landowner who'd given us permission to dig, came up, shook Walter and Carl by the hand, and then cried. And I had to say to him through the interpreter, why are you crying? He said, well, we find these people all the time. I'd never thought about them having families. So we made a breakthrough about how he looked at the war, not deliberately, but it was a different way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm. I think stories of the recovery and identification of these soldiers really helps, especially young people, realize that this is not some black and white thing that happened 100 years ago. These were real people, and it kind of humanizes the conflict.
I mean, when you can stand with a group of people in a cemetery and say, okay, yes, you've got a soldier here that's 15 years old. Okay, that's what a shame, and everybody goes to see the 15-year-old. Do you want to come with me now and see this guy over here? Well, why him? Go look at him. Oh, he's 67, and he's older than I am. Average age of British soldiers is around 27 years old. They're not kids. And then just being able to go and get people to do it. And on a very famous occasion with a very challenging group of girls from a London school actually having a situation where a fight broke out in the cemetery between three girls. And we broke it up. And then my wife, as a teacher, said, look, what's the problem here? And one of the girls said, I wanted to have a minute alone with this unknown soldier because he has nobody to visit him. And my friends made fun of me. So basically she launched an attack on them, which wasn't the most wonderful thing to do in a cemetery. But from the rest of the day, she was our shadow. She got it in a way that the other two didn't. And it makes a breakthrough possible because as you say, he humanizes it. Right.
Now, many of our listeners are familiar with the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at Arlington National Cemetery and the many cenotaphs in other countries around the world that memorialize World War I dead. In the case of the United States, the tomb includes unknowns from World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and until 1998, the Vietnam War. Yeah. The Vietnam unknown was ultimately identified due to DNA testing and was reburied at another site per the wishes of his family. With advances in technology, as this testing especially becomes cheaper, easier, do you think that we will ever be able to do the same for most of the recovered World War I unknowns? Or do you think there's even a will to do that, social or political?
I think that's the point, isn't it? It's the will to do it. I've already explained that as far as the War Graves Commission are concerned in the UK, if you're in a cemetery, you're there in perpetuity. You're not going to be exhumed to identify you, even though that might be the will of what might be your family. And in the case of a Second World War burial, the guy that did the work on these two chaps who were killed on a working party by a sentry, he was convinced they knew who they were. He was told in no uncertain terms not to contact the other family in case he upset them. He, by the way, ignored it and did get in touch. And ultimately, they were buried. And I have to say that the War Graves Commission at the proper burial in Poland, that's where they died, made no mention of his guerrilla work to identify them. So I think unless there's a change of attitude, and obviously the further we get away from the events, the less likely it is for people to say, let's revisit it. People might well, as they do in the States, look for dead post-1918 in the argument being, well, the families don't care. Well, in my experience, even over 100 years ago, the families do care. And somebody once said, a death in war is like throwing a pebble into a pond. The ripples go out and they come back, but they still affect things. And curiously, the idea is, the families don't care. You only have to look at the ceremony which occurs at the Menin Gate in Ypres every night. It's even now going on, and it has been going on since the 1920s when the last post is played. Particularly during the centenary, there were tens of hundreds of people actually at the memorial every night, Brits, Australians, Canadians, because their relatives are missing and they still want to know.
What is next for you?
I am now working on a new project, which is called CEMA, the Centre for Experimental Military Archaeology, here in Kent in the UK, where we've built a replica trench system for teaching. And at the moment, it's incredibly popular because of the problems with COVID. We can't actually get people over to the Western Front. So they're coming to us, which includes, by the way, young soldiers. And at the same time, I'm also working then on a couple of other book projects, one of which relates to, would you believe, the English Civil War in the 1640s, which is where I began my military history. So I'm finishing a book I started 35 years ago. I will get it done. At the same time, I'm restoring, even today, a Victorian house in which we live. So that's keeping me busy. I'm certainly not bored, although I'm looking forward to traveling again whenever I can.
Yes, I agree with you on that one. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. And thank you for your commitment to World War I archaeology and history in general. I think you have a dream job and career. Followed your work for a while now, and it is always a pleasure talking with you. So thanks again.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And who knows, I might even manage to make it back to Norfolk at some point if I can.
I hope so. Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.